Greetings, friends of liberty. President Trump turns out to be a very easy person to analyze because so much of what he or his administration says is either a direct lie, a knowing misrepresentation of the truth, or an indirect lie, a statement which the person makes wishing or hoping it were true without knowing whether it is. Let me mention three of President Trump's more egregious recent geopolitical lies which illustrate this. First, he claimed that the recent Russian war crime, in which Putin deliberately used ballistic missiles containing cluster munitions to target civilians in the city of Sumy, Ukraine, on Palm Sunday, killing 35, was a mistake. But of course, anyone following the war knows that Putin this time, like he has hundreds of times previously, intentionally and deliberately targeted and murdered civilians. No mistake, Donald. Secondly, Trump, on that same day, referring to Ukraine, said, "Listen, you don't start a war with someone who's 20 times your size and then hope people give you some missiles." What an obvious lie, since it was Trump's friend Putin who started the war. Thirdly, Trump said on April 2nd, they're losing on average 2,500 people today, young people, soldiers, Russians. Think of that. We have to get it stopped. It's a terrible thing. If Trump really thought it was a terrible thing, he would confront the perpetrator. But Trump, like Vice President Vance, who openly said he doesn't care about Ukraine, also doesn't care about Ukrainian dead. Trump will never act to hurt his friend Putin or Putin's Russia in any way. He admires the killer. Why does President Trump lie so much? At least for three main reasons. Number one, he doesn't know much about the world, being an intellectually lazy person, as many of his political advisors have attested. Number two, he lies to cover up the bad things he's done or wants to do, like molesting or raping women in dressing rooms or lying about President Zelensky in order to help his friend, the war criminal and dictator Vladimir Putin. And number three, he lies because he can't admit he makes mistakes, so he just keeps lying to cover up past mistakes. Now, in the same way that President Trump lies in general, so too he lies to the American people, specifically to stir them up against other innocent countries on the issue of tariffs and trade. Let's examine his top 10 fibs here. Lie number 10. The president on April 2nd specifically said, "For decades, our country has been looted, pillaged, and plundered by nations near and far, both friend and foe alike. American steelworkers, auto workers, farmers, and skilled craftsmen watched in anguish as foreign leaders have stolen our jobs. Our country and its taxpayers have been ripped off for more than 50 years, but it is not going to happen anymore." Is this true? No, one obvious disproof being that American GDP has increased enormously, about 6 times since 1975, from $6 trillion to about 28 to 30 trillion. Let's briefly review the history of American manufacturing to see why Trump is wrong. American manufacturing all started in New England in the early 19th century, since that region had lots of people and wealth with which to build new factories. Women, often from towns or the countryside, were employed in relatively large numbers, and soon immigrants too were pouring in from other countries, like the Portuguese to Rhode Island and French Canadians to Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Manufacturing, all things being equal, thrives on low-cost labor, which means that a country generally has two choices. It can either import lots of immigrants from poor countries like America did for a century, or if it prevents the mass immigration of poor people, it can build factories in their countries. One or the other. Now, America until the 1920s made choice number one. It simply imported something like 35 million mainly poor, low-skilled immigrants willing to work for low wages, and thus was able to manufacture everything from the low end to the high end in America. All of New York City was basically one huge sweatshop, operated very profitably by Jews, Germans, Italians, and others working for sweatshop wages. But when America later on started restricting immigration, then naturally after World War II, factories started being built in those other countries where lots of low-cost labor remained. And who benefited from those low-cost products? American consumers. The average American household for perhaps the last 2 decades saved over $2,000 annually just by importing and buying cheap Chinese goods from Walmart. A second reason that some factories were started elsewhere was because union labor and regulatory costs in the U.S. started becoming needlessly expensive. So naturally, the Japanese made and exported lots of cars into America, like the beloved Toyota Corolla and Camry that American consumers bought by the droves because they were a much better value than junky American union-made cars. But would Trump ever admit this? Of course not. He actually praised unions on April 2nd instead of admitting that the United Steelworkers and United Auto Workers make American manufacturing less competitive. A third reason why manufacturing has declined from 40% of the American economy after World War II to about 20% now is because of automation and robotics. Partly because of robotics, America still excels in high-end manufacturing, such as in making automobiles, aerospace products, computers, pharmaceuticals, and high-end machinery. And a fourth and final reason for less manufacturing is because America has legitimately become more of a service economy, producing more in entertainment, healthcare, and education, or in Silicon Valley, software or computer design. What all this means in total is that American manufacturing output, while using fewer workers, still overall produces goods of much higher total value than it did 50 years ago. But when Trump says we'll bring a lot of those 90,000 factories back that have been lost, that's just another Trumpian lie. Robotics alone means many will never return. Lie number 9. Trump claims that other countries are using tariffs to boost their own manufacturing. He said, if imposing tariffs and protective barriers made nations poor, then every country on earth would be racing to eliminate these policies. First, Trump forgets the fact that lobbyists for 200 years in America have pressured Congress to pass laws which harm the general public by protecting their own privileged industries. A typical protectionist example were the Corn Laws, enacted in England around 1815, which prohibited the importation of wheat into England. This protected rich landowners while making the price of bread more expensive for everyone. That's what tariffs do. They hurt the general public by protecting privileged industries. Just like Elon Musk's Tesla, it getting huge subsidies from the government at everyone's expense. Secondly, since World War II, Trump is wrong. Overall, world tariff rates have gone down from 1988 to 2015, falling on average in developed countries from 9 to 4%, and in developing countries from about 30 to 8%. So having seen just now why America engages in less manufacturing, less immigration, more unions and regulation, more robotics, and more services, is it, however, true that tariffs actually help businesses, whether in the U.S. or other countries, get stronger? No, they damage businesses in their competitiveness by preventing them from competing with the best companies around the world, while at the same time making domestic consumers pay higher prices. A typical example would be the huge American tariffs placed on imported sugar, which protects American cane and beet sugar producers, and make the price of American sugar double what it is on the world market, making poorer the hundreds of millions of Americans who consume it. Lie number 8. Not only did Trump on April 2nd, so-called Liberation Day, falsely claim the tariffs will strengthen American manufacturing, but he also gave a huge list of new American tariffs he claimed were set in response to other countries' tariffs. Payback or reciprocal tariffs. Trump said, reciprocal. That means they do it to us and we do it to them. Very simple. Can't get any simpler than that. But did he get them right? No, of course not. It's Trump. It was all a lie. So, for example, he claimed that Switzerland is levying a general tariff against the U.S. of 61%. The reality? 1.7%. He claimed that South Korea is levying 50%. The reality? 8.4%. He claimed Cambodia 97%. The reality? 7.9%. He claimed Vietnam 90%. The reality, 5.1%. He claimed Thailand 72%. The reality, 6.3%. China, he said 67%. The reality, 3% overall, having gone down on average from 14% in the year 2000. He said Taiwan, 64%. The reality, 1.7%. And on and on and on. How would you feel if you were a citizen of one of those countries President Trump lied about? Tariff lie number 7. Of course, after a week of this idiocy, the world financial system started grasping how destructive Trump's administration was becoming. And as a result, those holding U.S. Treasury bonds started a massive sell-off, increasing the price that the U.S. government would have to pay in the future to finance its debt. Trump, seeing this huge slap in the face to him, then naturally had no choice but to abandon most Liberation Day tariffs. What reason did he give? Another lie. He claimed that the markets got the yips. In other words, they were irrationally afraid of what was happening. But instead, the truth was that the markets were acting utterly rationally in response to his irrationality. Tariff lie number 6. Trump is putting out the truth that the U.S. used to have about a 25 to 40% average tariff rate during the 19th century. He said, from 1789 to 1913, we were a tariff-backed nation, and the United States was proportionally the wealthiest it has ever been. These tariffs, he claimed, allowed the U.S. to go without an income tax, relying solely on tariffs to fund the government. Is Trump right in saying tariffs were successful then? First, during the 19th century, imports only accounted for about 5% of American GDP. Now, directly, it's 15% and indirectly, maybe even higher. Secondly, American business and citizens during this period had no taxes at all, which was the actual reason why America grew extraordinarily productively by leaps and bounds in the 19th century. America in the 19th century thrived despite, not because of, tariffs. Thirdly, it would be nice if the American government were so small that it could subsist on tariff income alone, but that's no longer the case. During the 19th century, government expenditures from 1800 to 1850 were only about 2% of American total GDP. But in 2021, federal expenditures were 37% of U.S. GDP. Try raising 37% from tariffs. Finally, in the 19th century, America, again, had completely uncontrolled immigration, which meant all those incoming immigrants created many highly competitive factories, both large and small, in America. But Trump and his vice president both want to keep out immigrants, and then also they want to levy tariffs on those cheap products those immigrants make when they are forced to remain in other countries. J.D. Vance, for example, has claimed that Americans don't need low-priced goods, saying 1 million cheap knockoff toasters aren't worth the price of a single American manufacturing job. Vance, like Trump, wants all Americans to pay higher prices for everything and wants to funnel the proceeds of that tariff tax to his Rust Belt constituents. I can't imagine anything less patriotic. Tariff lie number 5. After President Trump, slapped in the face by the bond markets, reduced his highly punitive worldwide tariffs to 10% for most goods, he still, nonetheless, vastly increased his tariffs on China. They now stand generally at 145%. So here, Trump is engaged in a half-lie by pretending that China's low-cost manufacturing has hurt the U.S. when, in fact, it has helped it enormously. That's why Trump eliminated tariffs for Chinese-made computers, the iPhone, and other electronics, and is now suggesting he will lower rates even further. But I agree that Trump is right in recognizing that China is a geopolitical threat to the West with its genocide, human rights violations, and theft of intellectual property. So how should the U.S. and the West respond to China's crimes? First, by uniting together to fight China collectively, to force it to stop violating property and human rights. There's strength in numbers. But Trump, in imposing tariffs on all of America's Pacific and Asian friends and allies, in treating them like enemies, is accomplishing the exact opposite, driving them by his needless economic warfare more and more into China's arms. U.S. allies like Japan and South Korea are starting to talk with China because they realize they can't count on America to back them up economically or militarily. This destructive Trumpian approach was already exhibited in 2017 when Trump withdrew from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was formed with the exact goal of uniting America and its allies to resist Chinese economic and geopolitical aggression. But secondly, if China is making lots of low-cost goods like iPhones, like it has for decades, for everyone's benefit, then let them. America imports over $400 billion of Chinese goods and exports close to $150 billion a year. Fight China instead on what it does wrong, stealing IP, organ harvesting, murdering dissidents and Uyghurs, and their threatening imperialism against other countries, not on what they do right. Lie number 4. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs, enacted by Congress in June 1930 at the beginning of the Great Depression, were one of the reasons it lasted so long, the other being the disastrous policies implemented by Franklin Roosevelt, which according to one study prolonged the Depression by 7 years. Of course, the Great Depression was started by the Federal Reserve during the Roaring '20s when it goosed the stock market and general investment with artificially low interest rates for many years. President Trump said about the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that after the Great Depression started, they tried to bring back tariffs to save our country, but it was too late. It took years and years to get out of that depression, far longer than even FDR had that office. No, the reality is that by raising tariffs to 60%, Smoot-Hawley damaged both American and world trade. As economist Philip Magnus says, instead of boosting American industry, it precipitated a trade war of retaliatory measures worldwide. American agriculture bore the brunt of it as crop exports declined, accelerating the insolvency crisis on farm mortgages. The total volume of world trade declined from almost $3 billion in January 1929 to just $992 million in January 1933. Tariff lie number 3. Trump claims that in his previous term, his tariffs worked wonders. He said, "In my first term, they said tariffs would crash the economy. Instead, we built the greatest economy in the history of the world." Is Trump right? Did his tariffs work? No, what happened was that by slapping a 25% tariff on Chinese steel in 2018, all the thousands of American companies that used that very cheap Chinese steel, whose production was subsidized by the Chinese taxpayer, what could be better, had to cut back their production or close down altogether. As Reason magazine reported, the main losers of Trump's tariffs were American steel-consuming industries, everything from automakers such as Ford and manufacturers of heavy machinery such as Caterpillar to small companies that made beer kegs, nails, and industrial parts. The decision to slap import taxes on steel in 2018 was effectively a promise to protect the interests of steelmakers at the expense of thousands of other industries. That's protectionism, damaging the general welfare to help your crony capitalist friends. One estimate was that these tariffs led to a net loss of close to 250,000 American jobs. And the same occurred in American agriculture, with many American soybean farmers being put out of business when China, as a result of Trump's tariffs, shifted their purchases overwhelmingly to Brazil. Tariff lie number 2. Trump has claimed that the U.S. is doing well now, with billions of revenue coming in from tariffs, and that America has had increased job gains, saying, "I think the labor market's going to be fantastic. In a single month, 9,000 new auto jobs." You haven't heard that in a long time after auto workers lost more than 27,000 auto jobs in the final year of Biden. Is this the truth? No. Goldman Sachs estimates that the tariffs will create about 100,000 manufacturing jobs while destroying 500,000 others. So in the same way that Trump's tariffs against Chinese steel in the first administration in 2018 resulted in a net loss to the U.S. economy of about 250,000 jobs, this time a typical example of job loss is that of Mack Trucks, which will lay off between 250 and 350 workers over the next few weeks. A company spokesman said the layoffs are due to market uncertainty about freight rates and demand and the impact of tariffs. Similar statements by many other CEOs can be found. So, for example, Ryan Peterson, CEO of Flexport, warned that ocean freight bookings from China are down 50% since Trump's tariffs hit. That could potentially wipe out as much as $1 trillion in an economic activity if the tariffs remain in place for a full year. Thousands of American small businesses, including many iconic brands, will go bankrupt this year if the tariff policies on China don't change. Finally, Trumpian tariff lie number 1. Trump claimed that Taiwan has somehow been stealing from U.S. manufacturers, like Intel, and that's why the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation is the best in the world. He said, Taiwan, they took all of our computer chips and semiconductors. We used to have Intel, and Intel, it was run by a man named Andy Grove. And Andy Grove was a tough, smart guy. He really dominated the chip business. And then he died, and I guess they had a series of people that didn't know what the hell they were doing. And now it's almost exclusively in Taiwan. They stole it from us. What a pure lie. This would be like accusing Audi, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW of making great cars because they've stolen American auto tech. No, the Germans have always been great in manufacturing cars. They invented the automobile, for God's sakes. And in the same way, the Taiwanese have always been good at manufacturing semiconductors. Trump himself here specifically admits that after Andy Grove died, Intel lost the plot. A pure, bald-faced lie. And so now in a recent announcement, Trump tried to take credit for the TSMC starting some chip fabs in Arizona. But this was already in the works during the Biden administration as part of Biden's $39 billion CHIPS Act. No credit to Trump, and actually no need for that $39 billion subsidy anyway, since chip companies around the world are flush with cash. But why hasn't TSMC started fabs in the U.S. before? Because, as their founder Morris Chang said, because of costly federal regulatory requirements making U.S.-produced chips at least 50% higher in price. So even though Trump believes in deregulation, he would never mention these high American regulatory costs. No, it's much easier to lie and call the Taiwanese thieves. Happy for my part that here in 18th century England we understand very well that free trade and cooperation with our allies are the best way to promote both national prosperity and national defense. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.